14 billion before Christ, 13 billion before Christ, 12 billion before Christ, 11 billion before Christ, 10 billion before Christ, 9 billion before Christ, 8 billion before Christ, 7,500,000,000 before Christ, 7 billion before Christ, 6 billion before Christ, 5 billion before Christ, 4 billion before Christ, 3 billion before Christ, 2,500,000,000 before Christ, 2 billion before Christ, 1 billion before Christ, 100 million before Christ, 800 million before Christ, 750 million before Christ, 700 million before Christ, 600 million before Christ, 500 million before Christ, 400 million before Christ, 333 million before Christ, 330 million before Christ, 300 million before Christ, 250 million before Christ, 200 million before Christ, 175 million before Christ, 150 million before Christ, 125 million before Christ, 101 million before Christ, 100 million before Christ, 99 million before Christ, 90 million before Christ, 80 million before Christ, 75 million before Christ, 70 million before Christ, 60 million before Christ, 50 million before Christ, 40 million before Christ, 30 million before Christ, 25 million before Christ, 20 million before Christ, 10 million before Christ, 9 million before Christ, 8 million before Christ, 7 million before Christ, 6 million before Christ, 5 million before Christ, 4 million before Christ, 3 million before Christ, 2,500,000 before Christ, 2 million before Christ, 1,100,000 before Christ, a million before Christ, 900,000 before Christ, 800,000 before Christ, 700,000 before Christ, 600,000 before Christ, 550,000 before Christ, 500,000 before Christ, 471,170 before Christ, 400,000 before Christ, 300,000 before Christ, 200,000 before Christ, 100,000 before Christ, 99,999 before Christ, 90,000 before 80,000 before Christ, 70,000 before Christ, 60,000 before Christ, 50,000 before Christ, 40,000 before Christ, 30,000 before Christ, 25,000 before Christ, 20,000 before Christ, 19,000 before Christ, 18,000 before Christ, 17,000 before Christ, 16,000 before Christ, 15,000 before Christ, 14,000 before Christ, 13,000 before Christ, 12,000 before Christ, 11,000 before Christ, 10,000 before Christ, 9,999 before Christ, 9,000 before Christ, 8,000 before Christ, 7,000 before Christ, 6,000 before Christ, 5,555 before Christ, 5,000 before Christ, 4,913 before Christ, 4,000 before Christ, 3,000 before Christ, 2,500 before Christ, 2,250 before Christ, 2,000 before Christ, 1,999 before Christ, 1,900 before Christ, 1,871 before Christ, 1,811 before Christ, 1,800 before Christ, 1,758 before Christ, 1,700 before Christ, 1,653 before Christ, 1,600 before Christ, 1,555 before Christ, 1,500 before Christ, 1,450 before Christ, 1,400 before Christ, 1,360 before Christ, 1,300 before Christ, 12 before Christ, 1,200 before Christ, 1,111 before Christ, 1100 before Christ, 1024 before Christ, 1000 before Christ, 999 before Christ, 900 before Christ, 888 before Christ, 880 before Christ, 800 before Christ, 750 before Christ, 700 before Christ, 677 before Christ, 666 before Christ, 606 before 600 before Christ, 555 before Christ, 540 before Christ, 505 before Christ, 500 before Christ, 404 before Christ, 400 before Christ, 383 before Christ, 333 before Christ, 303 before Christ, 300 before Christ, 290 before Christ, 282 before Christ, 275 before Christ, 260 before Christ, 250 before Christ, 232 before Christ, 225 before Christ, 222 before Christ, 220 before Christ, 200 before Christ. M, 199 before Christ, 195 before Christ, 190 before Christ, 185 before Christ, 180 before Christ, 175 before Christ, 170 before Christ, 165 before Christ, 160 before Christ, 155 before Christ, 154 before Christ, 150 before Christ, 149 before Christ, 144 before Christ, 140 before Christ, 135 before Christ, 132 before Christ, 130 before Christ, 128 before Christ, 125 before Christ, 121 before Christ, 120 before Christ, 118 before Christ, 117 before Christ, 115 before Christ, 111 before Christ, 110 before Christ, 108 before Christ, 103 before Christ, 102 before Christ, 101 before Christ, 100 before Christ. 99 before Christ, 98 before Christ, 97 before Christ, 96 before Christ, 95 before Christ, 94 before Christ, 93 before Christ, 92 before Christ, 91 before Christ, 90 before Christ, 89 before Christ, 88 before Christ, 87 before Christ, 86 before Christ, 85 before Christ, 84 before Christ, 83 before Christ, 82 before Christ, 81 before Christ, 80 before Christ, 79 before Christ, 78 before Christ, 77 before Christ, 76 before Christ, 75 before Christ, 74 before Christ, 73 before Christ, 72 before Christ, 71 before Christ, 70 before Christ, 69 before Christ, 68 before Christ, 60 before Christ, 66 before Christ, 65 before Christ, 64 before Christ, 63 before Christ, 62 before Christ, 61 before Christ, 60 before Christ, 59 before Christ, 58 before Christ, 57 before Christ, 56 before Christ, 55 before 54 before Christ, 53 before Christ, 52 before Christ, 51 before Christ, 50 before Christ, 49 before Christ, 48 before Christ, 47 before Christ, 46 before Christ, 45 before Christ, 44 before Christ, 43 before Christ, 42 before Christ, 41 before Christ, 40 before Christ, 39 before Christ, 38 before Christ, 37 before Christ, 36 before Christ, 35 before Christ, 34 before Christ, 33 before Christ, 32 before Christ, 31 before Christ, 30 before Christ, 29 before Christ, 28 before Christ, 27 before Christ, 26 before Christ, 25 before Christ, 24 before Christ, 23 before Christ, 22 before Christ, 21 before Christ, 20 before Christ, 9 before Christ, 8 before Christ, 7 before Christ, 16 before Christ, 15 before Christ, 14 before Christ, 13 before Christ, 12 before Christ, 11 before Christ, 10 before Christ, 9 before Christ, 8 before Christ, 7 before Christ, 6 before Christ, 5 before Christ, 4 before Christ, 3 before Christ, 2 before Christ, 1 before Christ, 0 before Christ, 0.
Al bagno, non a letto.
Subscribe for other videos.